The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his iconic bearskin hat for what felt like the 100th time that week. At 28 years old, James had been serving as one of the Queen's Guard for nearly 5 years, and the weight of tradition rested as heavily on his shoulders as the ceremonial red tunic he wore with such pride. James came from a military family in Yorkshire. His father had served in the Royal Navy, his grandfather in the Army during World War II. When James was a boy, his grandfather would tell him stories about honor, duty, and serving something greater than yourself. Those words echoed in James's mind every morning as he prepared for his duties. At one of Britain's most famous landmarks, the role of a Queen's Guard wasn't just about standing perfectly, still and looking impressive for tourists, though that was certainly part of it. James and his fellow guards were highly trained soldiers, responsible for protecting the royal family and their residences. They underwent months of rigorous training, learning everything from crowd control to emergency response procedures. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of the job was maintaining absolute composure, no matter what happened around them. James had seen it all during his years on duty. Tourists trying to make him laugh by pulling funny faces, children attempting to get his attention with silly dances, and adults who seemed to think the guards were nothing more than living statues put there for their entertainment. Through it all, James maintained his discipline, staring straight ahead with unwavering focus. But there was something special about the children who visited the castle. James had a soft spot for the young ones who looked up at him with wonder and excitement. He remembered being that age himself, visiting London with his parents and being amazed by the guards in their magnificent uniforms. Though he couldn't show it outwardly, James felt a warm feeling in his chest whenever he saw a child's face light up at the sight of the ceremonial guard. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, James took his position outside the castle gates, unaware that this day would be different from all the others. The autumn air was crisp and leaves were beginning to change colors in the royal gardens. Tour groups were already forming, cameras were clicking, and the familiar sounds of excitement filled the air as visitors prepared to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. James stood at attention, his rifle held firmly at his side, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had perfected the art of looking both alert and distant, aware of everything happening around him while appearing completely detached from it all. His black boots were polished to perfection, his red tunic immaculate, and his bearskin hat sat at precisely the correct angle. As the morning progressed, James noticed the usual parade of tourists. There were families from around the world, school groups on educational trips, and elderly couples who had dreamed of visiting the famous castle for decades. Each group brought their own energy and excitement, but James remained focused on his duty. Little did he know that among the crowds gathering that morning was a family whose story would soon intertwine with his own in the most unexpected way. A family traveling from a small town in northern England, carrying with them both hope and heartbreak, was about to change everything James thought he knew about the true meaning of service and compassion. The stage was set for a moment that would capture hearts around the world, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful gestures come from the simplest acts of human kindness. James continued his watch, professional and steady, completely unaware that his life was about to take a turn that would make him not just a guardian of tradition, but a symbol of hope for people everywhere. Sarah Thompson held her 8-year-old son Tommy's hand tightly as they approached the magnificent gates of Windsor Castle. The journey from their small town of Harrogate had taken nearly 4 hours, but every mile had been worth it to see the excitement building in Tommy's eyes. This trip wasn't just a family vacation, it was something much more precious and urgent. Tommy had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 18 months earlier. The news had hit the Thompson family like a thunderbolt on what had started as an ordinary Tuesday morning. One moment they were a normal family worried about school projects and weekend football matches, and the next they were thrust into a world of hospitals, chemotherapy sessions, and medical terms they never wanted to learn. But Tommy was a fighter. Despite losing his thick brown hair to chemotherapy treatments, despite the countless hospital visits and the days when he felt too weak to play, Tommy never lost his infectious smile or his curious spirit. His parents, Sarah and Mark, drew strength from their son's incredible resilience, though they carried the weight of worry that only parents in their situation could understand. Tommy had always been fascinated by stories of knights and castles, brave soldiers and royal ceremonies. During his long days in the hospital, he would watch documentaries about the royal family and dream about visiting the places he saw on screen. The Queen's guards particularly captured his imagination. These tall, dignified figures in their brilliant red uniforms and magnificent bearskin hats seemed like real-life knights to Tommy's young mind. When Tommy's oncologist, Dr. Patricia Williams, suggested that the family take advantage of a brief treatment break to create some positive memories together, Sarah and Mark knew exactly where they wanted to go. Tommy's latest scans had shown encouraging progress, and the medical team felt confident that a carefully planned trip would be beneficial for the whole family's emotional well-being. The night before their Windsor Castle visit, Tommy could barely sleep. He had studied pictures of the guards online, memorized facts about the castle's history, and packed his small backpack with snacks and his favorite stuffed lion, which he'd named Windsor in honor of their upcoming adventure. Sarah had sewn a small patch onto his jacket that read, "Tommy the Brave," a nickname the nurses at the children's hospital had given him. Mark Thompson, a mechanic by trade but a devoted father above all else, had saved up for months to make this trip possible. Between medical expenses and reduced work hours to care for Tommy, money was tight, but some things were more important than financial concerns. Seeing his son's face light up when they first caught sight of the castle towers made every sacrifice worthwhile. As they joined the crowd of tourists gathering for the morning's ceremonies, Tommy's energy was infectious. Despite wearing a warm knit cap to cover his bald head and being smaller than most children his age due to his treatments, Tommy practically bounced with excitement. He pointed out every detail of the castle architecture to his parents, his voice filled with wonder and joy. Other tourists began to notice the special boy in their midst. His enthusiasm was genuine and pure, unmarked by the cynicism that sometimes affects adult visitors. Tommy didn't just see tourist attractions, he saw magic. He saw history coming alive. He saw the fairy tales he'd read about during long hospital stays becoming real before his eyes. Sarah watched her son with a mixture of profound love and heartbreaking awareness. She knew that moments like these were precious beyond measure. The family had learned to cherish every day, every smile, every instance of pure childhood joy that Tommy's illness couldn't steal from him. As they moved closer to where the guards stood at attention, Tommy's excitement reached new heights. He whispered to his mother about how tall and strong the guards looked, how perfect their uniforms were, and how he wished he could be that brave someday. Sarah squeezed his hand and whispered back that he was already the bravest person she knew. The moment that would change everything began so quietly that most people in the crowd didn't notice it at first. Tommy Thompson had positioned himself as close to Guardsman James Mitchell as the barriers would allow, his small face pressed against the metal railing, eyes wide with admiration and wonder. For several minutes he simply stared up at the impressive figure in the red tunic and towering bearskin hat. James, maintaining his rigid posture and forward gaze as protocol demanded, was nonetheless acutely aware of the small boy, who had stationed himself directly in his line of peripheral vision. There was something different about this child's attention. It wasn't the casual curiosity or playful attempts to break his concentration that James usually encountered. This boy's focus was intense, respectful, and filled with genuine awe. Tommy began to speak, not loudly or demanding attention, but in the soft, earnest voice of a child sharing his deepest thoughts. He started telling James about his journey to the castle, about how he'd dreamed of meeting a real Queen's Guard, about how brave and strong the guards were. Though James couldn't respond or even acknowledge that he was listening, every word registered clearly. "My mummy says you're like real knights," Tommy whispered, his small hand gripping the barrier. "She says you protect the Queen and keep everyone safe. I think that's the most important job in the whole world." Sarah Thompson stood behind her son, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she watched Tommy's innocent interaction with the stoic guard. Other tourists had begun to notice the scene unfolding, phones appearing as people sensed something special was happening. Tommy continued his one-sided conversation, his voice growing slightly stronger with excitement. "I'm going to be brave like you someday. My doctors say I'm already brave because I have to have medicine that makes me feel sick sometimes, but I don't feel very brave. I think you're much braver than me. It was at this moment that something shifted in James Mitchell's chest. Despite years of training to remain emotionally detached during his duties, despite the strict protocols that governed every aspect of his behavior while on guard, James felt something stirring within him that he'd never experienced before in uniform. The boy continued talking, mentioning his treatments, his hospital stays, his dreams of getting better and maybe becoming a soldier someday. With each word, James felt the weight of the child's courage and the profound unfairness of what this young boy was facing. Here was a child who was fighting a battle more challenging than anything James had ever encountered in his military training. And yet Tommy looked up to him as a symbol of bravery. The crowd around Tommy and his parents had grown larger, with people instinctively sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Cameras were discreetly raised, though most observers seemed to understand that this was a moment to be respected rather than exploited. Mark Thompson placed his hand on his wife's shoulder, both parents recognizing that their son was having one of those pure, magical moments they had hoped this trip would provide. They exchanged a look that parents in their situation knew well, and a mixture of joy in their child's happiness and the ever-present awareness of how precious these moments where James found himself in an unprecedented situation. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for this. Not for a moment when his heart was being pulled so strongly toward a child whose courage and innocence were breaking through years of professional discipline. Every fiber of his military training told him to maintain position, to remain unmoved, to continue staring straight ahead as he had been taught. But another voice, deeper and more fundamental, was telling him something entirely different. It was the voice of his grandfather, who had taught him that true service meant more than following orders. It was the voice of common humanity, reminding him that sometimes the most important moments in life require us to step beyond the boundaries of what's expected. The tension between duty and compassion was building to a crescendo that James had never experienced before. Around him, the crowd continued to grow, as if people could sense that they were about to witness something that would stay with them forever. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared millions of times across social media, and remembered as one of the most touching moments in the history of the Queen's Guard. James Mitchell, after what felt like an eternity of internal struggle, made a decision that went against every protocol he had ever learned. Slowly, deliberately, and with the careful precision that marked every movement of a Queen's Guard, James began to move. The crowd held its collective breath as they realized that the statue-like figure was breaking from his rigid pose. Parents lifted their children higher to see over the heads of other spectators. Phones were raised, and a hush fell over the entire area. James turned his head slightly toward Tommy, making eye contact with the small boy for the first time. Tommy's face lit up with surprise and delight, his mouth forming a small O of amazement. The guard's eyes, which had stared unseeing over the heads of countless tourists, now focused directly on this brave little boy who had touched his heart so deeply. Then, in a moment that seemed to unfold in slow motion, James reached up and carefully removed his iconic bearskin hat. The hat, which was not just a piece of uniform but a symbol of centuries of British military tradition, came off his head with ceremonial gravity. The crowd gasped audibly, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something unprecedented. James held the hat for a moment, as if acknowledging the weight of what he was about to do. Then, with infinite care and respect, he reached over the barrier and placed the magnificent bearskin hat on Tommy's small head. The hat was far too large for the 8-year-old, sliding down almost to his nose, but Tommy's smile could have powered the entire city of London. The moment the hat touched Tommy's head, something magical happened in the crowd. People began to cheer, not the loud, boisterous cheering of a sporting event, but the warm, emotional cheering of people who recognized they were witnessing pure human kindness. Cameras clicked and phones recorded, but there was nothing exploitative about it. Everyone present understood they were documenting something beautiful and rare. Tommy reached up with both small hands to steady the enormous hat on his head, his eyes shining with joy and disbelief. He looked up at James with an expression of such pure gratitude and happiness that several people in the crowd were openly crying. Sarah Thompson was sobbing with joy, her hand pressed to her mouth, while Mark wrapped his arm around her shoulders, both parents overwhelmed by the kindness being shown to their son. James, now bareheaded but somehow appearing more dignified than ever, smiled at Tommy, It was a gentle, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. The stern, intimidating guard had become a compassionate human being, making a connection with a child who needed to feel special and brave. "You keep that on for as long as you want, young soldier," James said softly, his voice carrying just far enough for Tommy and his parents to hear clearly. "You've earned it more than anyone I know." Tommy tried to salute, the oversized hat wobbling precariously on his head, but his determination to do it properly was evident. James returned the salute with full military precision, treating the 8-year-old boy with the same respect he would show to a superior officer. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. Here was a trained soldier acknowledging the courage of a child fighting his own battle. The other guards on duty, initially shocked by their colleagues' breach of protocol, seemed to understand the extraordinary nature of the moment. Rather than intervening, they maintained their positions with perhaps a bit more warmth in their expressions, as if James's act of compassion had reminded them all of the human heart that beat beneath their ceremonial uniforms. For several precious minutes, Tommy wore the hat with pride, posing for photos with his parents and chatting excitedly with James, who had temporarily abandoned his role as silent sentry to become simply a kind man talking to a brave little boy. The magic of the moment created a bubble of warmth and joy that seemed to encompass everyone present. The ripple effects of that extraordinary moment began almost immediately. Within hours, videos and photos of James Mitchell placing his bearskin hat on Tommy Thompson's head were spreading across social media platforms around the world. The images captured everything: Tommy's radiant smile, the gentle expression on James's face, the emotional reactions of his parents, and the warm response of the gathered crowd. News outlets picked up the story with remarkable speed. The BBC ran it as their lead human interest piece, and soon CNN, ABC News, and media organizations from dozens of countries were sharing the touching tale of the Royal Guard and the young cancer fighter. But this wasn't sensationalized reporting. There was something about the purity of the moment that brought out the best in how the story was told and shared. Sarah Thompson found her phone buzzing constantly with messages from friends and family who had seen the story online. "Is that our Tommy? We saw the video. We're so proud." The messages poured in from their small community in Harrogate, from nurses at the children's hospital where Tommy received his treatments, and even from complete strangers who had been moved by what they'd witnessed. Tommy himself was initially unaware of the global attention his moment with the guard was receiving. For him, the magic was simpler and more personal. A kind soldier had shared something special with him, had made him feel important and brave. He carried the memory of wearing that magnificent hat like a treasure, describing the moment over and over to anyone who would listen. Back at Windsor Castle, James Mitchell found himself in an unusual situation. Technically, he had violated protocol by breaking from his ceremonial role and removing his uniform hat. His commanding officers called him in for a discussion about the incident, and James prepared himself for potential disciplinary action. But the conversation that followed surprised him. Colonel Patricia Hayes, his commanding officer, sat across from him in her office with an expression that was difficult to read. She had pulled up news coverage of the incident on her computer, and James watched nervously as she scrolled through the hundreds of positive comments and shares. "Mitchell," she began, and James straightened in his chair. "In 30 years of military service, I've seen soldiers follow orders, break orders, and everything in between. What I witnessed today wasn't about following or breaking orders. It was about understanding the true spirit of service." She turned the computer screen toward him, showing messages from veterans, families of sick children, and people from around the world expressing their admiration not just for James's gesture, but for what it represented about the character of the British military. "That boy and his family will remember this day for the rest of their lives," Colonel Hayes continued. "And millions of people around the world are remembering why they respect the Queen's Guard. You showed them that beneath the ceremony and tradition were human beings committed to protecting and serving others." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by something deeper, a sense that he had found the true meaning of his service. The recognition from his superiors was meaningful, but more important was knowing that he had made a difference in the life of a child who was fighting his own brave battle. Meanwhile, the response from the public continued to grow. Parents of children with cancer reached out to share their own stories. describing how Tommy's joy in that moment had given them hope during their own difficult journeys. Veterans wrote about being reminded of why they had served their countries. Teachers used the story in their classrooms to talk about kindness and courage. The royal family itself took notice of the incident. While they couldn't comment directly on military protocol matters, sources close to the palace indicated that the gesture had been viewed favorably, as an example of the compassion and humanity that the guards represented, along with their formal duties. Perhaps most remarkably, the story began to inspire copycat acts of kindness. Other service members around the world found ways to connect with children in their communities. Police officers, firefighters, and military personnel started looking for opportunities to make meaningful gestures that would bring joy to young people facing difficult circumstances. 6 months after that transformative day at Windsor Castle, the ripple effects of James Mitchell's simple act of kindness continued to spread in ways that nobody could have predicted. Tommy Thompson's health had improved significantly, and his latest scans showed that he was responding exceptionally well to his treatment protocol. His doctors were cautiously optimistic, and Tommy himself had returned to school part-time, proudly sharing his story with classmates who hung on every word. The friendship between James and the Thompson family had grown beyond that single magical moment. With permission from his commanding officers and the blessing of the royal household, James had maintained contact with Tommy and his parents. They exchanged letters and occasional phone calls, with James providing encouragement during Tommy's more difficult treatment days and Tommy sharing updates about his progress and his dreams for the future. James had become something of a celebrity within military circles, but not in the way he had ever expected or wanted. He received invitations to speak at military academies about the human side of service, about how small acts of compassion could have enormous impact. His story was being used to help train new guards, not as an example of breaking protocol, but as a reminder that true service sometimes requires thinking beyond rigid rules. The children's hospital where Tommy received his treatment had reached out to James, asking if he would consider visiting other young patients. These visits, conducted in civilian clothes and on his own time, became a regular part of James's life. He discovered that he had a natural ability to connect with children facing serious illnesses, offering them the same kind of hope and inspiration that he had given Tommy that September morning. Tommy himself had become an unofficial ambassador for childhood cancer awareness. The video of him wearing the guard's hat had been viewed millions of times, and his story had been featured in documentaries about the power of human kindness. But Tommy remained remarkably grounded through it all, more focused on getting better and returning to normal childhood activities than on his unexpected fame. Sarah and Mark Thompson often reflected on how much their lives had changed because of that single moment of connection. They had received messages of support from families around the world, many sharing their own stories of children facing serious illnesses. The global community that had formed around Tommy's story provided them with emotional support they never could have imagined. The broader impact reached even further than individual lives. The story had prompted discussions about the role of ceremony and tradition in modern society, about how formal institutions could maintain their dignity while still showing humanity and compassion. Military organizations in several countries had reviewed their protocols, looking for ways to allow for meaningful human connections without compromising their essential functions. James Mitchell, now promoted to Lance Corporal, partly in recognition of his positive impact on the public perception of the Queen's Guard, still stood at his post outside Windsor Castle. But something had changed in how he approached his duties. He remained professional and disciplined, but there was a warmth in his presence that other guards had begun to emulate. Visitors to the castle often commented on feeling welcomed rather than merely tolerated by the ceremonial guards. The anniversary of that special day approached, and plans were quietly being made for Tommy and his family to return to Windsor Castle. This time the visit would be official, with James permitted to break protocol once again, not spontaneously, but as part of a ceremony recognizing the positive impact their story had created. On the morning of the anniversary, Tommy Thompson, now with hair growing back in soft curls and color returned to his cheeks, stood once again before Windsor Castle. This time he wasn't just a tourist hoping for a glimpse of magic. He was returning as a friend, as an inspiration, and as living proof that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in hospital rooms and family homes by the bravest soldiers of all. James Mitchell waited for him, bearskin hat in hand, ready to honor once again the young fighter who had taught him that true courage comes in many forms, and that the greatest service sometimes means simply recognizing the extraordinary strength that exists in ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Their story had become more than a viral moment. It had become a reminder of the fundamental human connections that make life meaningful, and the simple truth that kindness, shared between strangers, can change the world in ways both small and profound.